tonight I wanted to talk a little bit. It kept coming to me every week as part of this class. Somebody always pops into my mind. It could be a great saint, but more I've been wanting to share our homegrown saints with you. Because sometimes when we talk all about Maharaji or the Buddha, it's like, yeah, but they were enlightened. What about? So I was thinking about that a lot. And I was thinking about moving to Georgia and leaving California after I lived my whole life and coming to California. And I'm in out of California to Georgia. I'm starting a church here in a nonprofit. And I'm using the church as a way to reframe what is the church, right? It's a church, in the highest sense, like a church. And I started to think about all the churches that I had visited in my life. And I started to only think there was only one church that I felt like had that true spirit that I had spent time at, of Metta, like that spirit of Metta. And so for those of you in California, there's Glide Church. And it's not the same. And I want to talk about Reverend Cecil Williams because I turned 51. But I was introduced to Glide Church when I was 13. And Glide Church is in the Tenderloin District in San Francisco. And it was started by this beautiful pastor. And he started his church right in the heart of where everything was going on. There was prostitution, there was drugs, there was homelessness, there was tent cities, always in the Tenderloin, right? It was a place of a lot of suffering, a lot of addiction. And most people ran away from the Tenderloin, right? Because there was so many things happening there that were brutal. And so Reverend Cecil goes there and he starts this church and he starts this huge outreach ministry. So I want to tell you how I was introduced to that church. It was actually because I got in trouble for shoplifting. And I had all these community service hours. And I got in trouble when I was 13 because I had no money. I was actually trying to get a Valentine's Day present for my then boyfriend. So I walked into a Macy's and I was like, oh, he would like this. And I proceeded to put it in my bag and leave and all. Anyway, they gave me all these. So my mother was so mad and took me to a jail. Actually, I wasn't treated well at all, but that's how it goes when you're, in getting in trouble. But I remember they assigned me I don't know, it was hundreds of hours. So my mother was so angry with me and she drove me on Saturday morning to Glide Church and was like, you're going to work this off and then clean the kitchen. And, she was... And I remember being excited to go, actually. I was like, wow, look, this is a cool place. It was 8:30 in the morning and already there was hustling happening up and down the street. In my mind, that was kind of exciting. I was like, oh, okay, this is different, And so I went into the church and we were setting up for the lunch service there. And I remember when I went into the church, I just loved the people because the people who were in there cleaning and who were doing the services, everything was volunteers, right? And the people who were in there were people that had the most epic stories. Many of them had cuts on their faces. They were former prostitutes and addicts, and they had been living in such suffering, but Cecil rescued them. So they always would tell me these stories of I was face down in the gutter and then Jesus pulled me up and then I saw Cecil there and he walked me into the church, and they'd be crying, and their whole lives were changed. They were like, I haven't been on drugs in 1 year and 2 months and I'm healing my life. And I remember just crying. I loved these people so much. Some had missing teeth and scars, but they had this love, right? And I was like, oh, this fire for service. And man, it was, when people have gone through hell and survived, it can open them in a way that nothing else can, because there's this gratitude for existing. right? And their whole lives were dedicated to the outreach. Cecil just started the AIDS outreach ministry, the homeless ministry, the food ministry, and I would go on Sundays too. I started catching the BART train back by myself on Sundays to go to the services. And back then they had the choir, and the church was so ahead of its time because there would be everybody in that church. It was like all colors of people. There'd be trans community and people in drag, and there'd be little old ladies with giant hats, and there'd be Norwegian families visiting San Francisco. There'd be Asian communities, and it was like we were all there, and we would be singing, and then Cecil would start talking about God's love. That's all he ever talked about. And everybody was included. I remember sitting in the front seat of the front pew and just crying and thinking, oh, this is like real love. This was meta. And so I remember I spent the whole summer serving food and being with these people, and it forever changed my life because that's when I really learned about compassion. I didn't understand that I could love people that I didn't know. Like I loved these people, the people in the kitchen, the people in the food line, the children outside. I just would cry and cry. I just felt so much love. And and the feeling was that the compassion was a feeling that I wanted to reduce the suffering. So compassion is this feeling of love turned towards pain. It's love, actually. It's this love that wakes you up and it makes you want to serve, right? And Cecil stayed at that church as the leader of that church for, I think, like maybe 30 years. And then it got passed on, but there was something about his unconditional, non-judgmental love that included everyone. It was so meta. It was like the sun. Nobody could come in there and be turned away from anything. It didn't matter what you'd done, what you'd been through, what you experienced. And it was just that kind of love as like my grandmother. It wasn't like heavy Bible thumping. It was all he talked about was meta, basically, right? And he called it God's love, or however you want to think about what this meta is. But there's something very powerful. So a whole movement started around him, right? And all these he got funding. It started off very small. Some of you wrote that you'd been there as a child too. And when I was there, it was in the 80s. It was in the height of the AIDS pandemic, right? So there was a lot of people outside that were sick, and they had meal delivery services and care providers and a nurse outreach team. And, they were just holding space for that. And so I was thinking about that today, everybody, because as I drove by a church today, the temperature went so cold, and I saw rows of people out in front of this church, and they were under blankets. And there was something about Cecil and seeing that. I'd already been thinking about, what is a church? What kind of church are we going to be? What are our values? What is it based on? What can we do? Are we scared? Are we scared to open our hearts? Are we scared to serve? So I was thinking a lot about that. When I saw all those people and I saw the door closed, it made me sad, right? That all the doors were closed up and they were just under, I don't know, it just reminded me. So what I'm bringing up tonight is that we want to practice love also, right? Like, this is the church of love. Have you practiced with another being today? That's very important, right? At some point, we heal our hearts and then we take it out into the world, right? We shine it out. And I think what I've been missing hearing on any media is those acts of love and service that other people are doing. All we're getting bombarded with is like hatred and delusion, but it's very hard to piece through and believe that there's thousands of people doing thousands of kind acts. Still, love lives on, right? It's an unstoppable force. And I just want to encourage us to not give up on it. It can seem like the sun will never come out when we're in the winter, right? It's like every day is a dark day, every day is a rainy day. And then all of a sudden, right, it starts to rise again, right? And we can't give up on kindness. That our practice is about healing our hearts, but then it's about how can we make the world better? How can we make the world more wonderful? And I don't think we have to create a whole church in the middle of the Tenderloin. I don't know. I can't do that. That was Cecil's call. Cecil could do that, and he did it beautifully. And he had this cute little wife. I think she was from Japan. I'm not sure where she was from, but the two of them were always together, and she would have these fancy dresses on and be right there with the pots and pans and she would come in and just, this was their life. It was like, we're here to love, serve, and remember. There's nothing else to do on this planet. What are you going to do? Keep collecting money? That can help for a little bit. Yeah, that's one thing, but we have to really think about what is it like to have a metta heart in action. So I want us to think about, as we do these practices, that we're in training. And you can train for a long time before you run the marathon, right? Somebody might have to train and train and train and train. And then one day you're like, I'm ready for the 18 miles or the 26 miles. In a way, that's what metta is. It's like we're working out on these evenings. We're growing our capacity, and don't underestimate one person with a huge heart, the soul force that can be unleashed. Sometimes we doubt our own power. Do you know what I mean by that? One person's heart, one being can do tremendous good, right? So each day we're training. So I want you to think about this, because I dedicated 2025. Well, really, I dedicated my whole life. But you know how we like to break these up into bite-sized pieces. Was really about the heart. The heart practices, the heart medicine is coming back to this, but not doing it without wisdom, right? We need to also balance it with wisdom. My teacher, Jack Cornfield, who many of you might have worked with, he always talked about heart wisdom, right? The wisdom of the heart. The heart always knows what's true. The mind gets in the way, does it not? Right? The heart knows that person's not good for you. Run for the hills. But then the mind's like, well, or the heart says, don't go down that path. You don't want that job. Don't do that. Right? And when we ignore it, it's like, oh, then all these tangles come. Right? But the heart has a wisdom. And we are learning how to listen to that wisdom and not the insanity of the mind. And I think what happened to me was that summer I spent at Glide Church in the kitchen working off all those hours was a life transforming moment for me. For me, I felt that was God's love intervening, right? Reminding me of what is important. Even at 13, I understood, right? My life is connected to compassion. I want to live this. I want to be that. I want to be a person who walks through this world thinking about how to make things better. And so I've gotten away from the service component a little bit, and I realized I want to come back to that here in Georgia. Like, how can I serve, not just online, but like almost direct hand-to-hand service again? Right now, we're all like kind of so used to being one step removed from everything. Like, we don't really have to engage as much as we used to, because we can just go on our phone. Hello, can you send this to my house? Thank you, goodbye. Right? But there's something about being in the community, right? That engages us, where we're in the meetings of people, we connect, we see things, we see our humanity, right? So there's a little danger in this isolation era, right? And but we can still continue to grow. So So I wanted to talk about that with you tonight and also share another story. And then I'd like to take some questions and see how you're all doing tonight, see what's on your heart and mind. But I wanted to also share a little bit about how Metta is helping me, because I want to just acknowledge that a lot of us maybe have grown up with a lot of trauma. And I know for me, my mother and father had so much trauma, and then they didn't know how to raise their kids. I didn't see them for long periods. Even right now, I'm experiencing a big thing with my mother again, just around what happened, how we were raised, and all the things that went on. So my family has always been, I'm going to write a whole story about how dramatic and messy that is, but it has forced me to find a love within myself, right? And even now, going through, as many of you know, I've been in my road of trials. There's nothing like trials and tribulations and suffering to wake the heart up, right? Because you have to depend upon something bigger than what the ego can understand. So I want to just mention that as part of what reminded me about Cecil was I would see him at the end of church hugging everybody and reminding people you are loved. Like whatever has happened to you, whatever you have gone through, right? That there's a love that never can be distinguished, never can be taken away, extinguished, never can be. It's like it's our true nature. And so I realize for a lot of us that are going through family problems, the holidays can be hard for many of us, that the metta practice actually restores a love that we may never have received. That's really it. Like the love that we might not have gotten from people that we wanted. We can do this practice and give that love back. We can restore that. Does that make sense? And that's why I encourage people to do the practice with different ages in mind, because sometimes you might be doing it for your 3-year-old self or your 10-year-old self or your 18-year-old self or your 35-year-old self. And every time you're visiting that, you're restoring something that was not balanced, right? Something we needed. And I'm not saying that it does everything, right? But it can, I notice that the more I've done that, the more it has restored me on many levels, right? The love I felt like I didn't get from the family, the parents, the mother, father archetype, right? I can generate that for myself. And there's a great power in that. There's a great kind of resiliency. And we have to just be wise with that, right? There's a wisdom in that. But I just wanted to remind you that, because it also used to remind me of what Cecil would tell each person, like, you are the light. You are the love. Everything you're looking for is here in you, and I just always thought how profound that would be to hear, each time over and over. I'm just remembering our homegrown saint, Cecil, who's our ancestor now. May you rest in peace, Cecil. I'm sure right now he's in heaven doing some kind of beneficial activity on behalf of all beings somewhere in some dimension. Because remember that we have momentum with that, right? So let us think about this as we go out into our lives. Like, how can we be a benefit to somebody, right? Let's start remembering the service, acts of service again, right? Who can we help? Who can we support? Could even be very secretly, right?